All the helicopters had already left, but roughly 25 Marines were still on the ground near the demilitarized zone, taking fire from the ridgeline above them while North Vietnamese troops moved through the jungle nearby. The extraction had fallen apart in minutes. What had started as a routine mission would soon turn into a desperate fight for survival. Only hours earlier, the mission had seemed routine. A 5-man reconnaissance team had been inserted into rough country north of the Rockpile, near the demilitarized zone. The Marines were operating in steep ground cut with ridgelines and thick jungle, a place where visibility disappeared quickly and movement through the terrain stayed slow. Not long after arriving, the patrol began finding signs that other men had been moving through the area. Smoke drifted through parts of the jungle at different times of day. Trails showed recent use. At night, movement could sometimes be heard beyond the tree line, though nobody stayed exposed long enough to be seen clearly. The Marines reported what they were finding and called for artillery strikes on suspected enemy locations nearby. Over the next several days, the signs became harder to ignore. North Vietnamese troops were operating in the area. By the morning of August 8th, reports of enemy movement had increased enough that reinforcements from Company E, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines, had been flown in to support the patrol and bring the men back out. At first, the situation seemed to improve. The enemy had disappeared. The Marines searched nearby trails and tree lines, but the jungle had gone quiet again. With no immediate contact, orders were given to prepare for extraction. Helicopters were called in. For the men on the ground, it looked like the mission was almost over. The helicopters started to arrive later in the afternoon. The landing zone was little more than a rough clearing cut into uneven ground. The first aircraft came in and lifted away without trouble. And for a short time, it appeared as though the mission would end quietly. The enemy had stayed out of sight for most of the day. Trails had gone quiet. No movement had been reported nearby. Even the jungle itself seemed calmer than it had earlier. Then the firing started. Machine gun fire opened up from the ridgeline overlooking the landing zone, cutting across the clearing as helicopters attempted to lift away. The extraction was stopped almost as quickly as it had begun. Some helicopters managed to leave carrying Marines already on board. Others broke away before landing at all. The men still waiting in the clearing watched the aircraft disappear beyond the trees. The noise of the rotors had faded into the distance, leaving behind scattered equipment, wounded men, and Marines trying to understand what had just happened. Nobody expected the extraction to end that way, but by late afternoon, it had become clear they would not be leaving anytime soon. Captain Howard Lee began organizing the position. The Marines pulled inward and established a defensive perimeter along ground that offered at least some protection from the surrounding ridgelines. Fields of fire were assigned. Machine guns were placed where they could cover likely avenues of approach through the jungle. The ground around them offered little comfort. The position sat inside broken terrain where visibility remained short and movement stayed slow. Beyond the tree line, steep slopes and dense vegetation hid almost everything. Men posted security while others carried in what supplies could still be gathered from the clearing. As daylight began to fade, enemy movement started appearing in the jungle. And before long, the first probes against the perimeter began. The attacks began shortly before sunset, and as the evening wore on, became more aggressive. North Vietnamese troops moved closer to the perimeter, trying to locate weak points. The wounded added to the strain. Some men had already been hit during the failed extraction, and others were now being treated inside the perimeter while the fighting continued around them. Corpsmen moved from position to position where they could, working under whatever cover the ground provided. The Marines held their ground through the night. They had no way of knowing how large the force around them actually was, but the firing never moved very far away. During the late evening and into the night, aircraft tried reaching the stranded Marines. Major Vincel Hazelbaker brought his UH-1E into the landing zone under heavy fire and began dropping the supplies that the Marines needed if they were going to hold through the night. The aircraft lifted away and later returned again. The approach remained exposed, and enemy fire followed helicopters as they moved through the hills toward the perimeter. During one of the resupply attempts, enemy fire struck Hazelbaker's aircraft. A rocket hit the rotor mast while ammunition was being unloaded, crippling the helicopter and forcing it down inside the perimeter. By then, Captain Howard Lee had already been wounded during the fighting. Hazelbaker stayed. With communication strained and pressure growing around the Marines, he began helping direct support for the men still holding the perimeter. The fighting continued late into the darkness. By midnight, the Marines had gone into survival mode. There was no sleep, and the attacks continued in waves. At times, firing built suddenly from one side of the perimeter before shifting elsewhere. Short exchanges of gunfire were followed by stretches of quiet that rarely lasted long enough for anyone to relax. The Marines held their ground. Machine gun teams stayed in position through the night, while radio operators worked to maintain contact and coordinate support whenever possible. Ammunition brought in by helicopter earlier in the evening had helped steady the situation, but nobody knew how much longer the fighting would last. Sometime before dawn, supporting fires began striking enemy positions outside the perimeter. Aircraft and artillery worked ridgelines and suspected approach routes while the Marines stayed in place, waiting for daylight and whatever might come with it. By then, the men on the ground had already been fighting for hours. Morning still felt a long way off. As dawn broke over the hills, attacks were losing momentum. Napalm strikes hit parts of the ridgeline outside the perimeter. And later that morning, reinforcements finally began reaching the clearing. Additional Marines moved into the area and helped secure the perimeter that had held through the night. Positions were expanded, wounded men were gathered for evacuation, and attention slowly turned from survival to getting everyone out. By the afternoon, helicopters were landing again. The same clearing where the extraction had failed the day before was now being used to move wounded Marines and exhausted survivors back out of the hills. The men who boarded those helicopters had spent only one night on the ground. For many of them, it felt much longer. The fight near the Rockpile lasted less than 2 days, and by the time the remaining Marines were brought out on August 9th, 5 Americans had been killed and dozens more wounded. North Vietnamese losses were believed to be far higher, though no one on the ground knew that at the time. The fighting during Operation Prairie would continue for months across the hills and valleys south of the demilitarized zone. But for the men left behind near the Rockpile in August of 1966, the operation became something much more personal.
Hello. We here at Battle Docs would like to extend our thanks to the people who watch our videos. I think it's important that we remember these men and women who sacrificed so much for our country. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here. We'll see you on the next video.